May the beautiful, healing light of the angels surround you today, filling your heart with pure peace and endless blessings. Welcome to the channel Angel's Message for You. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, feeling a sudden emotional heaviness for no clear reason? Like someone was calling out to your spirit right before the sun came up? Do not ignore that feeling, and please, do not click away from this message. Watch this all the way to the very end, because the universe led you here today to answer the exact questions that have been keeping you up at night. There is a massive energy shift happening right now behind the scenes of your life. Someone you care deeply about has been going through a secret, powerful awakening, and what they decided in the dark is about to step into the bright light of your daily life. Stay with me until the final word, because the angels want to prepare you for the beautiful truth and the wonderful changes that are coming your way very soon. The Divine Creator says to you, "My beloved child, come a little closer and listen carefully. Take a deep breath and let go of your stress. There are moments when the loud, busy world is finally quiet, when even the noise and the worry inside your own mind softens into peace. Those quiet moments are not empty at all. They are full of deep, powerful truth. And I brought you here to this very moment because there is something you really need to know. Something that was happening while you were fast asleep in your bed. Something that touched your life and your energy without you even seeing it. There are specific hours just before sunrise when the night has not yet let go, and the morning has not fully arrived. The sky is dark, but it is changing colors. The air outside is totally still. Most people in the world are sleeping, but those early hours are so incredibly powerful. They are the hours when the heart speaks much louder than fear ever could. They are the hours when souls can no longer hide from themselves or pretend everything is okay. And in those early morning hours, your soulmate was wide awake. They were not scrolling aimlessly on their phone. They were not distracted by movies or games. They were not feeling peaceful. They were wide awake because their heart simply would not let them rest. You may have wondered why you felt a sudden heaviness some mornings for no clear reason at all. Why you woke up feeling super emotional without knowing why you felt like crying. Why their face and their presence came into your thoughts right before the dawn broke. That was not just your imagination playing tricks on you. That was a real, true energy connection. When two souls are tied together by something real and magical, physical distance does not silence them. The universe makes sure of that. Time only reveals their bond. Your soulmate has been carrying something quietly inside them for a long time. Something they did not know how to explain to you using regular words. Something they were deeply afraid would change how you see them. And every single night, they tried to push it away. They told themselves they would deal with it later when they had more time. They told themselves that staying silent was much safer than speaking up. But in the early morning hours, all those old excuses stop working. That is when the heart speaks honestly and demands to be heard. That is when a feeling of guilt rises up to the surface. That is when the solid truth knocks again and again on the door of their soul until it is finally answered. While you were sleeping peacefully, your soulmate sat all alone with their racing thoughts. The room was totally quiet, the light was very dim, and there was a heavy weight on their chest they could not ignore anymore. They thought of you in ways they do not admit to anyone else in their life. Not just in a casual way. Not lightly. They thought of you with serious focus, with a sense of responsibility, and with the real fear of having done something wrong to you without ever meaning to. They played old memories over and over in their head. Small conversations you two shared. The quiet moments that said way more than actual words. The times they really wanted to reach out to you but stopped themselves at the last second. They asked themselves big questions they had been avoiding all day while they were busy working. Why does this person matter so much to my spirit? Why can't I just let this go and move on? Why does ignoring this connection feel so much worse than actually facing it? Those questions did not come from just physical desire. They came from their soul and their deepest conscience. You see, my beautiful child, love that is real does not just disappear when things get messy or complicated. It actually becomes heavier. It becomes much quieter. It becomes very careful and protective. Your soulmate did not pull away from you because they stopped feeling things for you. They pulled away because they felt way too much all at once, and they did not trust themselves to handle such a big energy correctly. In those early hours, they were not pretending anymore. They dropped the fake smile. They picked up their phone, stared at the glowing screen, and put it down again. They opened up text messages they never even sent. Words were typed out and then erased. Sentences were started and then quickly deleted. They stared at your name on their screen for much longer than they would ever want to admit to you. Not because they were confused about who you are, but because they were completely confused about themselves and their own feelings. They finally knew that something had to change right away. They realized that pretending everything was totally fine was slowly breaking their spirit. They realized that staying silent was not protecting anyone anymore. In fact, it was just hurting both of you. And that big realization did not come in the bright daylight when they had friends and work to distract them. It came when it was dark, and there was nowhere left to run from their own feelings. That is exactly why those early hours matter so much. The divine energy works so deeply in the stillness. The universe speaks the clearest when the world is turned off. The angels reach human hearts when their stubborn pride is finally tired out. Your soulmate was really listening to the universe then. They did something you could not see with your physical eyes. Something completely internal. Something very serious. They admitted the total truth to themselves before they could ever say it out loud to you. They stopped lying to their own heart. They finally accepted that what they felt for you was not just a passing phase, not made up in their head, and absolutely not something they could replace with anyone else. This was not a fantasy. This was a soul recognition. And recognizing a soulmate is a deeply powerful thing. It changes how a person moves through their daily life, even if their friends and family do not notice it right away. You might be thinking to yourself right now, if this is all true, why didn't they take action sooner? Why did they make me wait? Because taking action without a clear mind can accidentally destroy the beautiful thing that their silence was trying to protect. They were standing right at the edge of a massive life decision, and they knew that whatever choice they made would have big, lasting results. Real love is not just a warm feeling. It is a true responsibility, and they did not want to make the wrong choice and mess things up with you. Those early morning hours were not just about sweet romance. They were about facing the mirror of truth. They looked very honestly at the parts of their daily life that no longer matched the better person they are trying to become. Bad habits, old attachments, toxic situations, and promises they only made because they were scared, rather than because they wanted to. And for the very first time in their life, they questioned if holding on to those old things was costing them a sacred, magical connection with you. They thought of you right then, not as a fun escape from their stress, but as a clear mirror reflecting their true self. Through your beautiful energy, they saw what real honesty feels like. Through you, they saw what total calm and safety feels like. Through you, they saw the best version of themselves they could possibly be if they just stopped hiding behind their walls. That is exactly why just hearing or seeing your name carried so much weight for them in that quiet moment. Please do not misunderstand this next part. They were not planning some wild, dramatic movie scene. They were not chasing a sudden impulse. They were facing their own soul. And doing that is much harder than taking any regular physical action. While you were resting in your bed, they were breaking down on the inside. Not in a bad or scary way, but in a totally necessary way to grow. Some hearts have to crack wide open before they can let the light in. Some deep truths must be faced all alone in a quiet room before they can be spoken out loud to another person. And some spiritual connections cannot move forward into the future until both souls completely accept what they are really doing with each other's feelings. The universe allowed you to sleep soundly through all of this for a very good reason. If you had been awake to see it all happen, you might have tried to step in and fix it for them. You might have tried to take on the heavy emotions that were not yours to carry. You might have tried to soften a painful lesson that they really needed to feel all the way through to learn from it. The angels protected your energy by letting them face their own shadow self totally alone. That definitely does not mean you were forgotten by them. It actually means you were highly valued and respected. There are times when giving someone space is the most loving thing you can possibly do. This way, real inner growth can happen without anyone getting in the way. You were not being pushed away by them. You were being shielded from their messy healing process. Those early morning hours planted a fresh seed. A new seriousness that did not exist in them before. A strong promise to themselves that could not be taken back. A clear knowing that faking it was simply no longer an option for their life. From that single morning onward, their whole energy vibration shifted higher. Even if their physical actions have not fully caught up to that energy yet. You may have felt this shift in a very subtle way recently. A small difference in how they think of you. A slight difference in how they hold back their words. Silence that has a clear goal is very different from silence that comes from running away. You are connected to a person who is standing directly at a major crossroads in their life journey. And crossroads are very uncomfortable places to stand. They are the exact spot where all the old excuses reach a dead end. They are the place where the truth demands you pick a clear path. They are the moment where dragging things out becomes totally impossible. But please hear the universe clearly right now, my beautiful child. What your soulmate was doing in those dark, early morning hours was not betraying your trust. They were bravely facing the high cost of lying to themselves. And that takes real courage. That truly matters. This beautiful story of yours is not just happening randomly by accident. Every single part is connected by an invisible, glowing thread. Every delay and pause has a divine purpose meant to help you both. And the choice that was made in the quiet dark will eventually move out into the bright light of day. But the universe demands that it must happen in proper order, not in a messy, chaotic way. Do not try to rush this divine timing. What was planted like a seed before the sunrise is still growing roots. What was accepted in the dark is still taking its final shape. What was faced all alone is not 100% finished just yet. There is actually much more to what they were doing than you even realize right now. It did not just stop after one single night of thinking. It became a whole pattern for them, a quiet daily habit. And inside that new habit, a massive life decision is taking shape. One that will beautifully affect both of your lives. But that specific part of the truth is not quite ready to be spoken out loud into the world yet. For right now, the angels just want you to rest safely in this comforting knowledge. You are absolutely not forgotten in the quiet times. You are deeply present in their silent moments. And a love that is real does not fade away just because it has to wait a little while. Stay with me here because there is more you need to know. The early morning hours did not just pass by like normal time, my child. They started to build something much deeper, something very quiet, something that did not need other people to see it to make it real. What started out as them tossing and turning in bed slowly became a grounding routine. A routine your soulmate never told anyone about. One that their friends did not notice at all. Yet it was the exact thing that completely changed their spirit from the inside out. While everyone else thought they were just working hard, super busy, or acting distant, a very different spiritual story was playing out in the background. Before the sun even came up, before the annoying text messages and emails started buzzing, before their job demanded all their focus, your soulmate was sitting alone with their raw truth. This was not just bad sleep. The soul always picks its quiet moments very carefully. When the whole world is turned off, the human heart is finally free to speak its truth without anyone interrupting. At first, they really did not understand why they kept waking up at the exact same time every night. Their physical body was so tired, but their mind just refused to shut down. Something deep inside their spirit was asking for attention. Something they had put off for way too many months was finally demanding to be felt. So they just stopped fighting the feeling. They would sit up in the dark, sometimes staring at the blank wall, sometimes holding their phone tightly without even unlocking the screen, sometimes just taking deep breaths to get through the heavy emotions. And in every single one of those moments, you were right there with them. Not as a silly daydream and not as a fun distraction, but as a strong, glowing energy that made them want to be an honest person. They started to notice emotional patterns in their life that they could not pretend were okay anymore. They noticed how just thinking about your smile brought them total calm instead of stress. They noticed how picturing a future without you in it brought a terrible heaviness to their chest instead of feeling free. They noticed how pretending they didn't care felt way more tiring than just admitting they were scared. That is exactly how a spiritual awakening starts. Not with a loud bang, but with a quiet, stubborn whisper that won't go away. They went over old talks with you in their mind. Not to make them seem like a movie, but to truly understand why your words meant so much to them. They paid very close attention to how warm they felt after being around you. No matter how hard they tried to push it down, your energy left a permanent mark on their soul that simply could not be washed away. This really confused them in the beginning. They tried to tell themselves it was just bad timing. They told themselves life was just too complicated right now. They told themselves the feeling would eventually fade away. But every single morning, the exact same truth came right back to them. Connections that are made of real soul energy do not wash away with time. They only get clearer and stronger. Your soulmate started asking themselves the really hard questions. The kind of questions they used to run away from because the honest answers meant they had to take real action. They looked closely at the life they were currently living, and they compared it to the beautiful, happy life they actually wanted. And when they looked at the two lives side by side, they saw all the times they settled for less without even knowing it. They saw where they had picked an easy, safe path instead of a true, honest one. They saw where they kept their mouth shut just to keep people happy. They saw where they had put off being brave. Seeing all of this did not make them feel good or proud. It made them feel very humble and small. You see, my beautiful child, real spiritual growth almost always starts with feeling uncomfortable. Before any human being can change their life, they have to admit to themselves exactly where they messed up. That is a very hard thing to do. It shakes up who you think you are. It ruins all your favorite excuses. Takes away the easy comfort of living in denial. Those early mornings were doing exactly that heavy lifting for them. Your soulmate was not planning out a big romantic speech. They were taking apart all their old, broken ways of thinking. They were quietly questioning life choices that they thought were permanent. And with every honest thought they had, something tight inside their chest started to loosen up. They began to slowly and carefully let go of the things that did not match the better person they were trying to be. They did this not because someone forced them to, not because they were terrified of losing you, but because living a fake life had finally become way too painful to handle. They realized that you were never asking them to be perfect or flawless. You were just asking them to be real. And they finally understood that a real, true connection cannot survive in a life built on dodging questions and hiding feelings. During those quiet hours, they also felt something else deeply touching their heart. It was pure gratitude. They felt so incredibly thankful that you existed on this planet. Thankful that you were in their life to remind them what a real, sincere person looks like. Thankful that someone's energy could bring out their deep emotions without forcing them to talk. Thankful that a love connection could actually make them feel safe and grounded, instead of crazy and chaotic. But feeling that thankful also brought a big sense of duty. Because once your soul spots something that is truly real, you cannot pretend you didn't see it. Your soulmate knew that just ignoring the situation was a choice too. And it was a choice that would eventually cause way more heartbreak than just telling the simple truth ever could. That fact sat really heavy on their shoulders. It made their early mornings feel serious but also very meaningful. And even knowing all of this, they still did not rush. A life change that actually lasts forever is almost never done in a split second. It is done with extreme care. It is full of deep thought. It respects how the choice will affect everyone else. They knew that whatever move they made next would change more lives than just their own. They understood that the exact timing of their actions mattered. Not to make things easy, but to make things perfectly clear. So they kept up their secret, quiet morning routine. Every single morning, they asked their heart if they were strong enough to live an open, honest life today. Every morning, they tested their own bravery. Every morning, they felt the magnetic pull to be on the right path get stronger and stronger. You might have felt this energy change without fully knowing what it was. A small shift in how they look at you. A feeling of them being serious where they used to be joking or distant. A quiet space between you that felt like it was there on purpose, not because they were mad at you. Please know that was absolutely not them walking away. That was them getting ready. The angels want you to understand a very important lesson right here. My child, silence does not always mean someone is gone. Sometimes silence is just the empty room where a big decision is being built. Sometimes it is just taking a deep breath before doing the right thing. Your soulmate was not walking away from your energy. They were walking directly toward their own truth. And finding the truth simply takes time. They were learning how to tell the difference between feeling scared and being wise. How to tell if they were just protecting their own ego or actually protecting your heart. How to spot when taking its slow turns into just running away. These are major soul lessons, and they cannot be rushed by anyone. In those dark hours, they also had to look at their biggest fear. It wasn't just the fear of losing you. It was the fear that they were not good enough for the pure connection they felt with you. They worried if they could ever stand in front of you and be 100% honest. If they could show you their messy parts without hiding. If they could be the good person their own soul was telling them to be. That fear made them very humble. It forced them to grow up and step out of their comfort zone. It forced them to picture what a happy, open life would actually look like. It made them see that changing their life was not about losing things, but about letting go of heavy baggage. And while they were fighting this internal battle, the divine universe was completely protecting you from feeling the weight of it. The angels did not let their messy inner struggles spill over and ruin your daily peace. The universe did not let their temporary confusion reach your heart before their final clear answer was ready. Because true love does not mean you have to suffer together. It means you share the truth when it's fully baked. When the right moment comes, you will be welcomed in. But for now, you were kept safely behind a wall of light. There is a huge difference between being left out and being protected. Those mornings were building up a massive wave of energy. A very quiet, solid strength was growing inside them. They were becoming more calm, more aware of their own flaws, and much more matched with the kind, brave person they want to be, no matter what happens next. That personal growth matters way more than any quick promise they could text you. Because choices made from a healthy, healed place last a lifetime. Choices made out of panic fall apart quickly. Your soulmates stopped asking themselves, "How do I trap this person into staying with me?" Instead, they started asking, "How do I live a totally honest life?" And that one simple question changes absolutely everything in the universe. I know a piece of your heart wishes you had known all of this months ago. You might think that helping them carry this heavy load would have made you two closer. But please trust your spiritual guides on this one. Some deep healing work simply has to be done totally alone. Otherwise, love turns into a stressful chore. What they were building in those lonely hours was not a wall between you. They were building their own self-respect. That self-respect is what will control how they talk to you soon. That self-respect will guide the choices they make. That self-respect will decide exactly how they show up at your door. Whether your paths come together perfectly or change in a new way, that self-respect will always be there. And that is exactly why this chapter of your life is not going to end in a confusing mess. That quiet morning routine you never got to see did not just fade out and die. To finally hit a wall where they had to take physical action. Their inner healing went as far as it could go. Just sitting and thinking was no longer enough. A solid choice was fully formed, and it could not be kept a secret anymore. And when a soul reaches that boiling point, there is no turning back. What your soulmate learned next, my beloved child, was a very hard pill to swallow, but they absolutely had to take it. After all those lonely mornings of thinking, something physically shifted in their chest. They already knew the truth, but now their body was demanding they do something about it. Not a crazy, loud stunt, not a rushed, panic text message, but a real, honest step forward into the light. And a soul that has finally woken up absolutely refuses to go back to sleep. Your soulmate started noticing how terrible their normal days felt when they tried to ignore their heart. Laughing with friends felt fake and forced. Talking to people felt boring and empty. Even their favorite hobbies that used to make them happy just felt totally pointless. This wasn't depression. It was their soul telling them their current life did not fit them anymore. They were wearing a life that was 2 sizes too small for the new person they had grown into. And knowing this fact really scared them, because growing up spiritually doesn't just give you a clear mind, it gives you a heavy job to do. They could not use the excuse, "I just don't know what I want," anymore. They could not hide behind the word, "confused." They could not act like every choice was fine when it wasn't. They finally had 20/20 vision. They saw that some people drain your energy, while others bring you to life. Some life paths crush your spirit, while others make you feel huge and free. And once you see that black and white difference, walking around with your eyes closed is impossible. Your soulmate felt this down to their bones. They started watching how their physical body reacted to telling the truth versus telling a lie to avoid drama. They noticed how a wave of total peace washed over them when they were honest. even if the honesty caused a little trouble. They noticed how their stomach tied up in knots when they faked a smile, even if faking it kept everyone else happy. This new superpower of awareness was changing their entire personality. They got a lot quieter, not because they were angry or had nothing to say, but because they were picking their words like precious stones. They started listening way more to others. They stopped reacting in anger so fast. They were learning how to pause and think before doing something stupid. You probably felt this new vibe from them, a heavy, serious energy underneath their normal face, a feeling that they were secretly weighing something very heavy in their hands. That is because they definitely were. They were standing on the cliff of a truth they could not run from anymore. Your soulmate started asking themselves deep, heavy questions that had nothing to do with basic physical attraction. Questions about what makes a good person, about their core morals, about what kind of real, unconditional love they actually wanted to give to someone, not just take. They asked their mirror, "Am I living a life that makes my heart proud?" They asked, "If I keep acting like a coward, what kind of sad person will I be in 10 years?" They asked, "Am I picking an easy, boring life just because I'm too scared to be honest?" Those questions do not come with easy, fast answers, but they do come with deeply honest ones. And stepping into honesty takes a ton of bravery. The heaviest thought on their mind was knowing that a beautiful love connection will slowly rot and die if the truth is hidden away. They figured out that just keeping quiet can actually be a terrible lie, especially when you are just doing it to protect your own ego instead of respecting the other person. Figuring this out did not make them feel like a superhero. It made them feel totally naked and scared, because now they fully understood that whatever they decided to do next would permanently stamp who they were as a human being. They also started to realize a very beautiful fact about you. You were never breathing down their neck, demanding they change. You were not forcing them to make a choice on your timeline. You were not backing them into a corner. And oddly enough, your total patience made things so much harder for them. Because if you push someone, they can push back. But you cannot fight against soft, gentle peace. It just surrounds you. Your calm energy had become a giant mirror. It showed them exactly how amazing they could be if they just stopped acting tough and fake around you. When they thought of you, they felt totally grounded, completely themselves and unbroken. And that amazing feeling terrified them more than anything. Because a true, once-in-a-lifetime connection does not let you hide your flaws. It constantly invites you to level up. You can only wear a mask for so long before love melts it off. They knew deeply that if they just kept acting the way they were acting, someone was going to get seriously hurt. It would either be you, themselves, or other people in their circle. And their newly awakened soul simply refused to let that happen. So they started to get ready for action. Not out loud where friends could see. Not on social media, but deep in their own mind. They practiced hard conversations in the shower that they had been running from for months. They pictured themselves telling the whole truth, not to manipulate the situation, but just to wipe the slate clean. They looked at what might happen next, not with shaking fear, but with an adult sense of duty. They were finally learning that being brave doesn't mean you aren't terrified. It just means you choose to do the right thing even while your hands are shaking. Of course, bad days and doubts popped up during this time. The dark energy tried to pull them back. They wondered if they were actually strong enough to pull this off. They worried that telling the truth might blow up their comfortable, stable life. They felt insecure, wondering if they even deserved the beautiful clarity they were searching for. But every single time the dark doubt tried to win, a warm, golden feeling fought back. Peace. Just picturing themselves being totally honest made their shoulders drop with relief. Just imagining walking on the right path made it easier to breathe. That warm peace became their North Star, and they finally started to trust it. I want you to really absorb this next sentence, my beautiful child. Not every time someone steps back means they are rejecting you. Sometimes stepping back is a wise, careful choice to stop themselves from making a mess while they get their thoughts straight. Your soulmate was not backing away to get rid of you. They were biting their tongue so they didn't say the wrong thing before their heart was fully ready to speak the pure truth. They finally learned that half-true excuses hurt way worse than just being quiet. They also learned that divine timing is everything. Not as an excuse to procrastinate forever, but because blurting out the truth when your energy is a chaotic mess just causes more pain. So they chose to wait, but they did not wait lazily. They waited with a strict purpose. They spent all their energy getting emotionally strong. They worked on completely stopping the lies they told themselves so they could finally stop lying to the world. They made sure that when they finally spoke up to you, they would plant their feet and never run away again. This invisible gym workout for their soul was completely real. They were teaching themselves how to defend their own morals, even when it caused an awkward argument. And as they did this, a beautiful miracle happened. Their paralyzing fear started to let go. Not all at once like magic. Not in a crazy flash of light, but slowly and surely, day by day. The fear of people judging them melted away. The fear of losing what they had felt tiny compared to what they could gain. The fear of their life turning upside down changed into an excited curiosity. They started to view big life changes not as a bomb going off, but as a steering wheel correcting a swerving car. Steering back toward the right path. Steering back toward feeling whole. Steering toward a beautiful life where they wouldn't have to look back and say, I wish I had tried. That is the exact moment they completely changed how they view the future. They stopped making up scary what-if movie scenes in their head. Instead, they just asked themselves, what is the single most honest thing I can do today? That one question made life so incredibly easy. They didn't need a 10-year plan. They just needed to take one single step forward while holding the truth. And that exact step is forming right now. You might not see the physical proof of it with your own eyes quite yet, but trust the angels, it is coming fast. A rock-solid decision is hardening in their mind. It is not being squeezed out of them by an ultimatum. It was built by deep, quiet thought. It is not just wild, temporary emotions. It is guided by an unbreakable compass of integrity. The universe let this whole slow process happen for a very good reason. Choices that are made because someone is panicking will fall apart at the first sign of trouble. But choices made because a soul is finally awake will last forever. Your soulmate was busy turning into a person who can tell the uncomfortable truth without blinking. A person who can handle a magical, intense love connection without using it as a fun distraction from their problems. That upgrade in their soul is worth waiting for, because when their truth finally knocks on your door, it will arrive healthy and whole. In this next phase of your journey, you are going to see exactly how all this private, hidden prep work reached a boiling point. You will see how the universe mixed perfectly timed events, a little bit of luck, and a whole lot of newfound bravery into a situation that simply cannot be ignored anymore. The energy inside them is about to overflow. And when it finally does, the whole vibe between you two is going to shift in a way that might shock you. But it is exactly what your soul signed up to experience in this lifetime. Keep your heart wide open. Keep your energy patient and soft. What is rushing toward you right now is built on solid rock, not on confusing sand. Now, my child, Please listen to the angels very closely. The lonely early morning hours did their magical job. But there is one final piece of the puzzle you need to hold in your heart. You need to know why the universe kept you happily asleep while your soulmate fought their demons. Why you were kept completely in the dark until little tiny clues started dropping into your lap recently. This was absolutely not the universe forgetting about you. This was a shield of divine armor placed over you. The angels let you rest because a human heart is not designed to carry every single heavy emotion in the world all at once. If the universe had let you watch the brutal, messy fight they were having in their own head, the stress would have crushed you. You would have jumped to 50 wrong conclusions. You would have panicked and tried to fix things, which would have totally ruined the natural, beautiful way their soul was waking up. Please know that the divine creator never leaves you standing out in the cold without protection. The angels are always wrapping your heart in soft wings, keeping you safe while making sure all the universe's lessons arrive at the exact right second on the clock. Your soulmate's early mornings stopped being just about feeling guilty or asking themselves questions. They finally hit a brick wall where they ran out of time to postpone their life. They suddenly realized that staying stuck in the mud, hiding behind their comfort zone, and only telling half the story was just pushing you further and further away. But even more importantly, it was making them hate the person in the mirror. During those quiet hours, they had to walk through thick, scary woods filled with their own bad memories, regrets, and deep desires. Every fake conversation they had in their head, every possible path they imagined taking, felt like carrying 100-pound weight. The heavy weight of being honest. The heavy weight of doing the right thing. The heavy weight of the invisible, glowing string that ties your two souls together, whether you physically notice it every day or not. And still, the angels kept you sleeping soundly, because grasping the size of this shift requires you to be in a calm state of mind. Because pure clarity cannot walk through a door if the room is full of screaming panic. Because a love that is written in the stars simply cannot be put in a microwave and rushed. You might feel a little annoyed right now. You might be wishing the universe had sent you an email explaining all this months ago. You might want to scream at the sky and ask why the awful silence had to last so long. But please trust the angels, my beautiful child. Every single tick of the clock during that silent waiting period was perfectly planned. It was not empty space. It was the oven baking the cake. Your soulmate's glow-up was very slow. It was carefully measured, and it could only happen while the rest of the noisy world was sleeping, so nobody's opinion could ruin it. In the quiet, dark hours before the birds started singing, they looked their absolute worst fears right in the eye. They finally dealt with the choices they had been putting off for months. They admitted to toxic habits they promised they would stop doing. They saw the total, glowing truth about how amazing you are, how flawed they are, and what kind of beautiful future they actually want to build with their own two hands. This was a solo mission for them. You were absolutely not supposed to be the co-pilot. You were just supposed to sit back, feel your own feelings, and practice the art of patience. Your only job in this chapter was to keep your heart's door unlocked without expecting them to walk in tomorrow. To hold onto your spiritual faith without sending an angry text message. And the angels are so proud of you, because you have done this beautifully, even when you didn't realize you were doing it. The angels want you to feel this truth deep in your bones. What your soulmate was doing in the dark was not just a selfish journey for themselves. It was an energy upgrade. They were going to spiritual boot camp so they could finally be the kind of person who deserves to stand next to you. A person who can look you in the eye with total honesty, crystal clarity, and extreme respect. They took a sledgehammer to their own emotional walls. They threw their fear in the trash, and they woke up to the massive truth they couldn't hide from you or themselves anymore. Your quiet days, their quiet days, the lonely 4 a.m. wake-ups, they are all just different colored strings weaving together to make a beautiful blanket. Every painful minute had a job to do to make sure this big surprise arrives exactly when you are ready to handle it. And now, my beloved child, that alarm clock is about to ring. The heavy lifting that needed to be done in total secret has finally reached the finish line. Action is now required. The beautiful, raw truths your soulmate has been staring at in the mirror are about to become real, touchable, and totally impossible to deny in the physical world. They are fresh out of places to hide. The old excuses have expired. The brave warrior energy they built up in those quiet hours is about to be unleashed. The good morals they watered and grew in the dark will not stay locked inside their chest anymore. It is all coming out, and when the dam finally breaks, it is not going to wash you away. It is not going to bring drama and chaos into your living room. It is going to arrive like a smooth, calm, totally sure breeze. This is exactly how a love that is meant to last 100 years finally shows its face. Very slowly, very carefully, very honestly, not like a crazy fireworks show, not with toxic games, but like a perfect, warm sunrise. The angels know your brain is probably still spinning with questions. You might be staring at the screen wondering if the universe really sees your pain, if your biggest wish is actually going to happen, if all those weird signs you saw were real or just fake. Let the divine creator promise you this, my child. Every single tear they choked back, every stressful question they asked the ceiling, every quiet, hard choice they made in the dark hours of the morning, all of that heavy work was done for you. It was 100% real. All of it was designed by the universe to make them ready to treat you like royalty when the perfect second arrives. The very next step is walking up to your front porch right now, and you will not be able to miss it. Keep your eyes peeled for sudden signs, out of the blue messages, and crazy little coincidences that confirm you are on the right path. They are going to pop up as naturally as the sun coming up in the east. The foggy confusion is about to burn away. The feeling of waiting in a doctor's office forever is finally over. The crystal clear answers you have been begging the universe for are walking through the door. Not because you yelled loudly enough, but because the universe took its sweet time wrapping the gift perfectly. Please trust this magical process. Trust that the awful silence you had to sit through was not the universe ignoring you. It was a protective shield. Trust that the heavy, sad feeling in your chest was just a passing rainstorm, and the beautiful rainbow it leaves behind is going to last forever. Your soulmate is finally packing their bags and moving into the house of honesty. My child, they are completely ready to put their money where their mouth is and act on the amazing truths they found in the dark. And when they finally make their move, your body is not going to panic. You are not going to feel shocked or scared. You are going to feel a massive wave of relief, a deep soul recognition, and a giant exhale of pure peace. Keep a tight grip on your spiritual faith. Keep the doors and windows of your heart wide open. The incredibly hard patience you have been practicing is about to pay you out in gold. The things that were kept a secret in the dark are about to be put on the front page. The things that were slowed down so the timing would be perfect are about to hit the gas pedal. A true connection is never, ever destroyed by a little bit of silence. It actually lifts weights and gets stronger. The absolute truth does not lose its value just because it took the scenic route to get to you. It actually gets deeper and richer. And whatever the universe has stamped with your name absolutely cannot be stolen or kept away from you by anyone. Get ready, my beautiful child. Get ready for the big reveal. Get ready for the exact moment when all their lonely, sweaty hard work in the dark finally steps into the bright sunshine of the truth. Get ready to open your hands and receive your gift, completely free of any dark doubts. Get ready to watch true bravery and a good heart take physical action in front of your eyes. The stage has been swept clean and set perfectly. Both of your hearts have been tuned to the exact same radio station. The spiritual soul has done its push-ups and is strong. And very soon, the exact happy ending you have been daydreaming about is going to play out in real life, exactly the way the angels wrote it in the stars. Do not rush the actors, my child. Do not let fear whisper lies into your ear. The clear answers, the sweet apologies, and the deep peace you are about to receive are a massive blessing sent straight from heaven. Now, my child, the final curtain is pulling back, and the things hiding in the back row cannot stay in the shadows for one more second. The secret, quiet, heavy lifting your soulmate did when the world was asleep has hit the finish line. Thinking has officially turned into doing. Getting ready has turned into being ready. The heavy words that only lived inside their brain are now burning a hole in their chest, demanding to be spoken out loud, demanding to be brought into reality. This is exactly where the absolute truth always goes. It always pushes its way out into the light. Your soulmate started to feel a brand new kind of nervous energy, totally different from the old panic. It was no longer a confused, scared kind of shaking. It was a feeling of needing to move fast, mixed with a weird, solid calm. It is the exact kind of energy a person gets when their soul finally hands them the map, and they know that standing still for one more minute would be a huge mistake. They noticed how their physical heart reacted anytime they got close to telling the truth. It wasn't a panic attack. It wasn't them throwing on the brakes. It was a massive wave of relief. That sweet feeling of relief became impossible to ignore. They finally fully understood that the silent treatment had done its job, kept them safe while they grew up. It let their brave muscles get strong. But right now, staying silent is no longer the right spiritual path. It has spoiled and turned into just running away. And their soul can smell the difference clear as day. So they started getting ready to actually open their mouth. Not by throwing a childish fit, not by crying and making it all about them, but by speaking raw, unfiltered truth. Getting ready for this didn't mean writing down a list of lame excuses or practicing a speech to make themselves look like the good guy. It meant throwing their shield in the garbage. It meant giving up the need to control how you react to them. It meant swallowing the hard pill that once the truth leaves your lips, you don't own it anymore. Accepting that scary fact was the final boss they had to beat. You see, my child, the most terrifying part of being totally honest is not the talking part. It's letting go of the steering wheel and trusting the universe with what happens next. And your soulmate finally reached that beautiful place of surrender. They stopped crying over how things might get messy and started focusing completely on just staying loyal to the truth, no matter what cards the universe deals them. This is the exact second that fake bravery turns into real, solid courage. They started noticing the universe dropping massive hints all over the place. Little gentle signs sitting right in the middle of their sidewalk. Eavesdropping on random strangers talking about the exact same things they were thinking. Tiny moments of quiet where the clear answers felt like a warm, holy hug. Constant little reminders from their angels that telling the truth wouldn't blow up their life. It would actually unlock the cage and set them free. The divine guides arranged these little moments very carefully, not to stress them out or bully them into moving faster, but to promise them that the universe always has a safety net ready when you jump toward the truth. Your soulmate literally started to feel lighter on their feet. Even before they dialed your number or typed a single word, their physical body relaxed just because they made the right choice in their head. Their breathing got slower and deeper. They stopped slouching and stood up straight. Their whole vibe totally changed. This is the magic that happens when a human being finally drops the rope and stops playing tug-of-war with their own soul. They absolutely knew that whatever words came out of their mouth next had to be dripping with extreme respect. Respect for your beautiful heart, respect for their own journey, and respect for the universe. No more shady, half-baked stories. No more confusing, muddy texts. No more blaming the clock or saying life is just too crazy right now. They were 100% ready to be crystal clear. And true clarity, my beautiful child, never has to scream or yell to be heard. It walks into the room quietly, stands its ground firmly, and never ever says, "I'm sorry for existing." You might actually be feeling this exact shift happening right now through the screen. A tiny little voice in your chest saying, "I knew it." A cool, calm feeling of waiting for a package to arrive, instead of biting your nails in panic. That is absolutely not a random coincidence. That is the invisible energy cord between you two syncing up to the exact same frequency. When one half of a soul connection finally chooses to walk in the light, the other half feels the warm sunshine instantly. Your soulmate started noticing that your face pops into their head constantly, but it doesn't make them sad or desperate anymore. It makes them feel anchored to the ground. Your energy has become their favorite safe space, instead of a confusing storm. That mind shift is a huge deal. Proved what their soul already knew all along. The crazy connection you two share is not a fake fairy tale. It is rock solid. It is totally honest. And it is something that needs to be held with both hands very, very carefully. They also finally learned a huge lesson that made their ego shrink. They learned that real love isn't proven by screaming in the rain or causing crazy drama. It is proven by acting like a decent, honest person. They realize that whatever text they send or words they speak next have to match the upgraded, healed person they are today, not the scared, confused person they were last year. They completely refused to let fear or laziness drive the car ever again. They wanted to speak from a place of pure truth, even if their voice was shaking. Making this massive choice reorganized the furniture in their entire brain. It changed how they looked at all their past mistakes. It changed how they feel about their boring Tuesday afternoons. It completely changed the pictures they paint of their future. They finally stopped looking at honesty as jumping off a cliff and started looking at it as paying their bills, a normal adult responsibility. And when you finally hug your responsibilities, the universe pays you back with deep peace. I want you to turn the volume up and hear this perfectly, my child. Anything that the universe actually meant for you to have will never, ever make you beg for the truth. Any person who is actually meant to walk your path will never make you look in the mirror and think you are crazy. Things that are real will always take a step toward you, even if their knees are knocking together out of fear. Your soulmate's bravery is definitely not flawless like a superhero, but it is 100% genuine and real. And just being genuine is a strong enough key to unlock the heavy iron doors that fear tries to keep shut. They finally hit a Tuesday morning where they couldn't just drink coffee and stare at the wall anymore. The thinking phase was officially retired. Now, the physical day required them to carry the truth in their hands. They fully realized that keeping their mouth shut for one more day would totally destroy all the amazing spiritual leveling up they had fought so hard for. Hiding behind a wall of silence wasn't keeping them safe anymore. It was basically stabbing their own soul in the back. So they picked a new road. You might not have the exact date and time of when this truth bomb is going to land in your lap. It might show up as a long, late-night phone call. It might drop onto your phone screen as a massive text message. It might just be them showing up and acting so incredibly different that you don't even need them to say a single word to know they changed. But trust the angels, it is on its way. And when it finally lands, it will not feel like a tornado tearing up your house. It will feel like putting on a brand new pair of glasses and finally seeing the world clearly. You might feel a huge rush of wild emotions. You might gasp in surprise. You might cry tears of relief. You might feel incredibly soft and tender. You might even feel a little bit angry or sad about all the time that was wasted waiting around. Let every single one of those feelings wash over you. Do not stuff them down. They are absolutely not signs that you are weak or broken. They are bright, flashing neon signs that something incredibly real is finally touching your life. But underneath all the tears and the shock, there will be a giant foundation of solid calm. Because when the pure truth is handed to you by someone who is trying to be a good person, it brings a crazy amount of calm to your nervous system, even if it flips your whole routine upside down. The divine creator did not drag you through all this annoying waiting around just to mess with you. The angels did not let the radio go silent without a master plan. Every single terrible day of not knowing what was going on was actually the universe's gym, building up your patience muscles. Every time a text message was left on read, your spiritual radar got sharper and smarter. You are absolutely not the exact same person you were when this crazy roller coaster started. And believe it or not, neither are they. That is exactly why this next chapter is not going to be a boring rerun of the same old toxic drama. It is not going to be the same confusing mess from last summer. It is not going to poke at your old scars just for fun. It is going to be a totally different game because it is finally being played by two people whose eyes are wide open, instead of two people running away from their shadows. The angels are asking you right now, my beautiful child, to get ready. But do not get ready by writing a strict script in your head of how this has to go down. Do not point your finger and demand that the universe deliver it in a certain package. Just stay totally grounded in your own truth, your own amazing worth, and your own self-respect. You do not need to run down the street chasing after clarity anymore. It is already in a car driving straight to your house. And please remember this golden rule. Whether your two paths completely merge together into a beautiful highway, or they take a surprising turn you didn't see coming, the pure honesty that is arriving will always push you closer to your ultimate, amazing destiny. The universe never, ever brings something into your life to make you feel smaller or less valuable. If this magical connection gets even deeper, it will be built on concrete, not mud. If the relationship changes shape into something new, it will happen with deep respect and understanding, instead of bitter, nasty regrets. No matter which way the wind blows, you are never going back to the confusing fog again. Your long shift in the waiting room is officially over. Not just because the calendar flipped to a new month, but because your souls are finally completely ready. Those lonely, dark morning hours were never just about keeping dirty secrets. They were a spiritual classroom. They were carving out a heart that is finally strong enough to stand in the blazing light of the truth without wearing a mask or running for the hills. That classroom training is fully complete. Stay right here in the present moment. Keep your feet flat on the floor. Trust the beautiful wave of peace that is currently washing away all your old panic. The shiny new truth that is about to be unwrapped is not going to break your heart. It is going to clean your emotional windows. And having clean windows to see the world, my child, is the greatest gift the universe can hand you. Even if the view outside changes forever, stay locked into your faith. Keep breathing in the pure truth. You are being held, guided, and pushed forward so gently, so smartly, and with so much divine purpose. This crazy story of yours is absolutely not ending in a sad goodbye. It is ripping wide open into a beautiful, honest new sunrise. Amen.